A huge welcome to everybody joining us for our webinar today. This is a really exciting webinar because we have got a topic which we know is hot off the press, really popular. Everybody wants to know tips, tricks, and ways that they can secure their Wi-Fi networks, keeping your environment as safe as possible. And we have got a industry expert and legend joining us today. So, Mac, why don't you do a quick round of introductions for us?
Of course, of course. So it's Matt and Mac from Ekahau. We both are directors of product marketing and ECSE. So it's Ekahau training and stuff. Joined as always by the wireless Stu from Too Awesome and Dale from Pennsylvania somewhere. And the star of the show today is Jennifer Minella, known as JJ. So probably one of the most well-known, if not the most well-known persona in the security space connected to Wi-Fi. So JJ, thank you very much for joining us today. How are you doing today?
Hi guys, I'm great, except for Mac. I think maybe your English isn't so good. I'm definitely not the most well-known persona in security, but I'm very happy to join you guys.
You are not? Okay, tell me who is better well known than you in wireless space when it comes to security then?
You know what? I'll think about that and I will come up with something for you, maybe even two or three people for you when we get to the end. How about that?
Of course,
I
you are
think
honest.
I think you're just being too modest, JJ. We have had the pleasure of sitting in on some of your trainings at some sessions, as well as seeing you speak, and we know you're definitely one of the best out there. So we're so happy to have you here with us today.
I'm happy to be here.
Mhm. Okay, well, I will stop my slides now, so I'll let you take over, JJ. Mhm.
Anders, um, yes, I finally figured out how to play Snake. Um, I didn't, so I yeah, I didn't know. And so the first time I saw it going across the screen, I thought it was a progress bar loading, right? Because it's just like this black thing that comes across the screen. And then it said game over, you lose. And somebody had to explain to me what was happening. So I'll just tell on myself there. But yes, I have figured it out now and I'm quite proficient. All right,
Mm.
everybody. So I wanted this, as always, one of the things I love about the Ekahau webinars is that you guys are always so interactive and there's lots of great kind of conversation that goes on. So I am going to pull the question in the chat thing over here just to try to keep a pulse. You guys are too many too fast for me to really, but definitely use the Q&A if there's an actual question, and the guys will make sure we get to that. I would rather, kind of address these things as we go along instead of holding questions to the end. So I wanted to just kind of talk about Wi-Fi security. So we're coming off of WLPC. It was great to see those of you that were there. And we taught so JD and I taught a boot camp on security architecture for wireless, which is the Wi-Fi aspect, but all of the other things that go around it. And then, of course, we also have a deep dive there where we get into security migrations for WPA3, et cetera. So I thought it would be interesting, when Matt popped up and said, "Hey, let's talk about security," because there's so much of the security aspect tied to Wi-Fi that really is dependent on the design, having a proper design to start with. And there's a lot of things that we can tell when we do a survey and while we're doing a survey. And so I thought it would be kind of cool. One of the things we didn't get around to teaching at WLPC is some of the aspects of actually doing a security assessment and what that looks like. So this isn't, how to perform a full assessment, but it is what the things to look for while you're doing your design and your survey, and just how to start incorporating that mindset in while you're doing the work that you're already doing. So these are things that don't take extra time, don't take a lot of extra energy. So let's dive in here. Oh, and I am going to totally plug the book. So if you guys haven't seen it, the guys are going to show you. Yeah, I did publish a book with Wiley on wireless security architecture. You can get it on Amazon, Kindle. I think even like O'Reilly has it on their online learning platform. Thanks, Julian just popped the link in there. So it is a robust book. I also have a free ebook that I'll share a link to at the end of this. It's my friend called it a tome. So it is 600 pages, which is a lot, but it's broken into sections that you guys can take in little bite-sized pieces, and hopefully it'll help you do your job regardless of whose equipment you're using. It covers Cisco, Aruba, Extreme, Mist, all of the stuff that I could find for you. So looking back, and I've worked in wireless. Now, I don't consider myself like a wireless professional the way that a lot of you guys are, and the way that Matt and Mac and Stu and everybody here is, but I've definitely worked with wireless for a very long time. So I started doing wireless in the late 90s, pre-standards, back when we had Intel stuff. And at that point in time, of course, it was just for business purposes, it was more just a little AP here and a little AP there. Everything was autonomous, and we weren't really architecting for security. We were just happy to have something cool that didn't have physical connections to it. So as we kind of look at the progression of security, and there's a reason I don't dive into this a lot during any talks or even in the book, and that's because we're at 2024 now. So a lot of this stuff that you see in the history of Wi-Fi security is just completely irrelevant. We really shouldn't be talking about WPA anymore. This is more than 20 years old at this point. And there was a time, I mean, I think still when some people were saying, don't use WPA, don't use WPA, those of us that were working in security architecture were saying, well, you can use WPA. It's very long in the tooth. It's not secure, but you need to do a lot of mitigating controls. You need to design around it so that that's not a point of weakness and a point of entry into the network. And so just as a little bit of history here, WPA popped up early 2000s, and it was really just a stopgap while everybody was working on the 802.11i standard. So we got into that. When we got to 11i, we were in that robust security network architecture. And before that was this transition security network. So that was WPA. It was never intended to be used for a long period of time. It was just, let's do something better with the hardware capabilities that we have right now. Then we got to WPA2. And if you guys look at this, something that's alarming to me always is that we've had WPA2 for about 20 years. It is way past its prime. In security ages, this thing has like died, been buried, and mummified 3 times over. It is just needs to go away. So we're finally at this place where we have WPA3. And you guys probably, if you've ever seen me do something before recently with wireless security, you know that I love WPA3. Great security enhancements, especially for passphrase networks. But it is where we need to be going as an industry. And it is what you're going to have to do when you get to 6E and 7. So that's kind of the foundation. What I wanted to do is talk a little tiny bit about just the differences. So for those of you that aren't familiar, if you're not living in this space and seeing this content all the time, I have one little quick slide on kind of talking through the 3 different security profiles, and then the differences with WPA 2 and 3, just as a little bit of context and groundwork getting into some of the other conversations. And one of the things that I like to point out here is I don't love the name personal. That's a Wi-Fi Alliance name for something. I tend to call these passphrase-based networks because personal is very misleading. Out of well over 1,000 organizations that I've worked with, and mid-market enterprise and up to Fortune 50 size companies, one of the things that's very prevalent is we always have these passphrase networks for something. Very, very few organizations have purely 802.1x and nothing else, if they have Wi-Fi at all. So this to me is something that's very prevalent, and this is a focus point for me because it's one of the weaknesses that we often overlook, both in terms of like configuring it properly, segmenting it properly, over the air encryption. And so that's going to be a little bit about what we're thinking about and looking at as we talk about security assessments. So the overview here is that, the use case is moving left to right. Obviously, on the enterprise stuff, we like to use 802.1x for our, I'm air quoting, secured networks, where it's our stuff, our resources, our users, our machines, typically, computers that are either fully owned and managed or at least partially managed by the organization. So that's our kind of golden key, cream of the cream security within the Wi-Fi standards. And then we have the passphrase, which is, obviously that's the one where you're just putting the passphrase in. And that tends to be used several different places. Everything from it's really a guest network, but we just want to keep the casual person walking by off of it, to, okay, well, we need something that's maybe it's even for our employees and our team members, but it is we don't want them to have to go through a captive portal repeatedly, and or we do want it to be encrypted. And as you guys know, the open networks until just now have not been encrypted. And then we get into use cases for passphrase networks like all of the IoT stuff and headless devices, or anything that's just too much trouble to get like a certificate or configure a machine account for to do 802.1x. So this is actually, from a user population standpoint, these networks here are actually very well attended, if you will. And then we get into the open and enhanced open. And the enhanced open, I'll just kind of work backwards on the slide here. We've had open. The enhanced open simply adds encryption to an open network. It is unauthenticated encryption. It's based on a Diffie-Hellman exchange. So it doesn't validate anybody's identity. It doesn't do anything else other than it just says, okay, this is now encrypted over the air. You're done. So that's a nice security impact, because what everything tells us now is that we should be encrypting everything over the air. And that's just sort of an expectation that's happening, in addition to the expectation that all of the applications that we're using are also going to have application layer cryptography and encryption. I will say that for right now, I've seen mixed numbers on this. Enhanced open networks do something a little bit wonky. So I'm not going to dive too much into that, but that would be one of those, just test it extensively before you use it. So only work backwards here. Getting into the passphrase network, the biggest increase, and I have one slide on this a little bit later. The biggest increase we have here in security, I think, for WPA3 is here in this middle section. And it is moving from the PSK algorithm into the SAE algorithm. So PSK is no more. Pre-shared key, where we actually, the passphrase we type in is how the key, the cryptographic key, actually got derived. We're not doing that anymore in WPA3. It's way more secure. It's much more awesome. And we also get the benefit of maybe a domino effect from that algorithm change, which is the devices each have a unique key. So it doesn't matter, even if we have a shared passphrase, we all have different cryptographic keys, which is nice. The cryptographic key length is separate from the passphrase length, also very nice. And we also get perfect forward secrecy. So that's where in WPA2, one of the attacks is somebody can sit there and just passively sniff and collect traffic. They can crack the hash of the passphrase offline, or it's probably just written on a sticky note somewhere. And then they can decrypt all of the packets from everybody before, captured up until that time, at that time, and into the future. So with WPA3, we don't have that. It's sort of like a rolling code there. And then protected management frames. So one of the things that's happening across all of these three types of networks here when we get into WPA3 is protected management frames, which is really awesome because we are adding integrity to the communication between the AP and the endpoint that's connected to it.
Hey, JJ.
Yeah.
I just asked people in the chat, what are they mostly using for their networks at the moment? Are they still using WPA2, or have they started to shift to WPA3? And it seemed like pretty much most people in the chat are still using WPA2. There's a few people saying they're trying to move to WPA3, but having some issues with some client compatibility. So I would love to get your thoughts and feedback on that. Have you seen many of your customers or people you're speaking to jump to WPA3, or what is kind of the barrier or hurdle from moving people from that 20-year-old protocol to something that has been around now for the last few years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I see DeMarco and some others saying, they've been testing WPA3 and a lot of things don't support it. So I can talk to that a little bit. I actually don't have slides for that built in here, but there's not really a quick answer. The quick answer is, like, the customers I'm working with are dipping their toe into it because there are some challenges with it. So the easy answer is that when we're talking about the enterprise networks, so over here on the far left, you can very safely go ahead and transition these into like a transition mode network that supports both on the same SSID. That's pretty safe. I have not yet personally, now this is anecdata, right? This is just one person's experience. It is one person's experience with a lot of people testing in deep dives in labs, but it's still anecdata. I have not personally had any systems that had an issue with an 802.1x transition mode network or an 802.1x WPA3 network. Because remember, if we back up 2 slides, WPA3 and PMF has been out for coming on 6 years now. So if it's been updated, if it supports 802.1x, it's probably been updated in the past 5 or 6 years. And if it's been updated, it probably supports this with the asterisk that, I'm not promising you can just go whole hog and like flip that network to WPA3, but I would feel very comfortable instructing most customers to say, you can take this 1X network, put it in transition mode, see what's still connecting in your dashboard, whatever product you use, hop in there, look and see what's still using WPA2, go find those and update drivers, push out GPO, whatever you need to do, and then get all the way into WPA3. The passphrase networks with personal are a different story and a different beast. And this is something I've been, kind of chipping away at to understand why. So I constantly am asking Peter McKenzie about stuff, and I'm constantly asking Stephen Orr about things to kind of wrap my head around this. There are a lot of reasons things might not work on a passphrase-based network, and especially when we get into transition mode. And then especially when we enable FT roaming on that network. So sometimes it's that an endpoint doesn't know what to do with multiple AKMs. So AKMs, when you see the beacon advertisement from a network, and you guys know this way better than I do, but it's going to advertise its capabilities. And so those different authentication and key management suites, traditionally endpoints were used to seeing one per network. Then we get into FT. So that happened several years ago, right? With the 802.11r roaming. And then it was suddenly saying, so we had our base AKM advertise. And then sometimes we had that FT. And now there are 2 AKMs being advertised. And sometimes that broke endpoints. So the same thing can happen if an endpoint broke with that. The same thing can happen when we start doing, I'm going to scribble over. Let me scribble over here. If we have a base AKM, whatever that is, let's say this is a personal, WPA2 personal. And then we add the WPA3 AKM. So now we're in the same situation where there's two AKMs and the endpoint isn't sure. And so a lot of times what they'll do is they will just spaz out and they don't even attempt to associate. So you don't really have an indication of this from the infrastructure that happened unless you're really, really looking for it. So various combinations of these things can cause problems. The multiple AKMs, or there are some endpoints who are okay with multiple AKMs, but not if they don't understand one of the AKMs. And so the example I use is like if you're like us from the US, and you're used to seeing English, and suddenly there's a sign that has English and Polish and French, and I don't speak Polish and French, I should just look at the English part and go, okay, I'm not worried about this stuff. I can read the sign in English. I'm going to keep going. But some of these endpoints go, oh, I can't read the other 2 things, so I'm just not even going to try. So there's about 4 different permutations of issues. And if you want to know exactly why something's not working, you've got to test through each of those permutations. That was a long answer for your mileage will vary on these passphrase networks. And so the answer there tends to be make 2 SSIDs.
Dale, you got a question?
Yeah, so JJ, another question that was asked. So is it true that WPA3 Enterprise 192-bit only allows ETLS? And if so, is it ETLS 1.3 or does it also allow 1.2?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't off the top of my head know that answer. I would assume it's 1.3. And yes, 192-bit, which is a weird number. They took 256 and 128 and mashed it together and got 192. So it's derived from the links of the hash and the key length. But yeah, I would assume it would force 1.3. However, most of the time, up until 192, I would kind of steer people towards always tunneling TLS from an EAP standpoint. So your inner authentication methods are like MS Chat v2, username and password. TLS certificates. All of those or any of those can be tunneled inside of a secure tunnel. So that could be PEEP is a tunnel. It could be TTLS is a tunnel. It could be TEAP, TEAP is a tunnel, which is my personal favorite. So when you put it inside of a tunnel, you as the infrastructure are controlling that. Whereas typically with, and Anders, this is the reason I'm not sure about this. So traditionally with WPA2 and getting up to 190, up to, but not including 192-bit on WPA3, it's the endpoint that picks the TLS version. And so it could be using an unsecured or an insecure version like 1.2. And that is one of the reasons that we tunnel it. So I'm not sure about the 192-bit because a lot of this is theoretical in books and people are just now starting to test and deploy it. So we'll do a follow-up and I'll answer that question once I've actually seen it.
Great. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer that. We've seen lots of great questions coming in, which we'll try and get to during the rest of the webinar.
Yep. I do see one about, does the endpoint hardware need to be compatible to use WPA3? The answer is yes. Now, typically that can be just a software update if that device has been created anytime in recent history. I think a lot of the problems that we hit with some of those IoT type of devices is, and I'm throwing IoT around really loosely, in anything that's not a normal compute device with a user attached to it is going to fall in this category for today's purposes. So that could be everything from weird printers to, your smart plug and devices to lighting systems to HVAC controls to screencasting devices, etc. Not all of those things get updates regularly. In fact, some of them are provisioned using, like Bluetooth, right? You get physically near that device, you configure it from a phone app, it connects to then a Wi-Fi network and you leave it alone. So those things don't always get updated. And I think that's one of the challenges we have, but definitely the endpoint will have to support it.
Okay, and if the endpoint does not support WPA3, what happens to the endpoint when it tries to connect to WPA3 enabled network?
If it doesn't support WPA3 and you are trying to get it to join a WPA3 only network, it will not.
Perfect. That was another question.
Yeah, if you're trying to get it to join a transition mode network, which is just the same SSID going WPA2 and WPA3 together, this is where you get into these multiple AKMs, unknown AKMs, and then it's just, it might work, but there might be 3 reasons that it doesn't work.
Okay, that's fair enough. So since we are still discussing WPA3 and stuff, we have a highly upvoted question from Brian. While it is a political opinion, with BYOD being so popular, when or how should we start telling users if it doesn't support WPA3, it's not allowed?
Oh, Brian, that's a great question. And I think BYOD especially is such a cultural, so sometimes it's a political conversation and sometimes it's very much a cultural conversation. To me, this is I'm not trying to dodge your question. I'm going to give you an 80-20 answer here in a second. It is very specific to the organization's risk tolerance, how much flex can they offer to their users? What is the risk associated with that? Because if it's a leisure network, if it's, hey, we just want you to have an internet-only network for you to connect your phone to or your Sonos speaker, whatever it is, and stream music or whatever you want to do, and it's not actually interacting with any corporate data, I don't want to say who cares, but to me, that's a much lower risk than you're using a personal device and you work in an industry or in a place that has protected data, intellectual property, PII, health information, credit card, whatever that is, long list of stuff, then I'm a little more dodgy about it. So from that kind of political, cultural standpoint, it's, maybe the answer is you carve out a network for them that stays WPA2 and it's just segmented off and that's fine. If it is a BYOD device and it's and we're talking about, phones, tablets, laptops, chances are it's going to support WPA3 because remember, it's been out since 2018. And if not, typically just a firmware upgrade on that NIC is going to solve that problem. But yeah, there's a whole other can of worms when you get into BYOD stuff. And I do actually teach a in-depth class on planning around that with the legal and technical aspects of navigating BYOD. There's a lot to unpack there for sure.
That answers the question. Well, most of it. Thank you very much, JJ.
Yeah. Okay. And I see some of the questions some of these I'm going to get to, so I'm going to keep going, and then you guys interrupt me at any point.
Of course.
So protected management frames, which I'm not going to dive into too much today, but I do want to kind of offer this information because I think this is something a lot of us are still figuring out, and it's not well understood. So protected management frames, as I mentioned a minute ago, adds integrity between the access point, so the infrastructure, and the endpoints, because up until now, all of that communication has not had integrity, which I'll explain, and none of it has been encrypted. And so protected management frames, I think most people that I've interacted with recently, they're jumping straight to this use case on the right, which is, oh, that means it's encrypted. One subset of action frames and unicast is encrypted. The rest of it, really all we're looking to do is this right here, which is add integrity. And that just means I want to make sure if I'm an endpoint, when I receive an instruction from the infrastructure, I want to make sure that the AP I'm connected to is actually who's telling me to do that, because those instructions can lead to man-in-the-middle or on-path attacks or denial of service attacks. And so a lot of those might look like channel changes, deauthentications and disassociation. So this integrity component is just to prevent spoofing from other devices in the space who might be able to spoof the endpoint or spoof the AP and cause either the infrastructure or the endpoints to do things that they were not intended to do.
So JJ, if I have a network and an access point with an SSID configured with PMF enabled, and I was to bring along a little device like this, perhaps, I think you know what it is,
Yeah.
and I was to use one of the features on here, that's the deauth feature, would that network be then protected from the deauth attacks from a device like this?
Yes, with an asterisk in theory.
I've scared JJ away now, have I?
Yeah, she's gone.
Didn't want to ask that question. I'm running.
So one of the things I went full, I swear JD was going to kill me. Jake printed this awesome box. I love it. I went full like late 80s, 90s retro here. I'm just going to share this because it's so pretty.
Yeah, I'm very jealous of your Wi-Fi cover that I saw for it.
So pretty. So somebody says it looks like 1992 Taco Bell menu, and they're not wrong. But yeah, so these things have a deauth. Now, a few things. They're 2.4 only. So on a 5 gig network, I wouldn't worry about a Dolphin. But certainly there's plenty of other tools out there that run on, things that have 5 gigahertz radius. So I'm going to tell you like what the spec says and the standard says, and then what we've kind of seen in the real world. The specification says if the endpoint is connected with protected management frames, so that could mean a WPA3 only network where everything is using PMF, or a transition mode network where some of the endpoints might be connected with WPA2, but other endpoints are connected with WPA3 and therefore using PMF. So in these cases, the ones that are protected with PMF, international symbol for PMF, I don't know. The ones that are protected with PMF over that management connection should ignore anything, including a broadcast deauth that's not sent from the AP they're connected to, because they're maintaining states, and they have this integrity check built in here that's related to this. Now, I say in theory, what we have seen, and actually Peter, I think, did this a little bit accidentally after some conversations in Prague and was messaging me in the middle of our deep dives. And then he started testing more, and then we started testing. We did it in the boot camp. We did it in the deep dive. One of the things we've seen is that not all endpoints currently honor that, meaning some endpoints, including my brand new Google Pixel 8 phone, even when it's connected with WPA3, if it sees a broadcast DOF, it was disconnecting. I don't know the rhyme and reason. I don't have enough data to pinpoint like patterns with this. We did collect some packet capture so that we can turn this into some of the working group that's interested in why these devices are misbehaving. And so a lot of the reason that whole PMF and WPA3 is complicated is because a lot of these devices are misbehaving in that they are performing operations off standard spec. And that is what makes this so hard, because if everything were playing like it should and just following the rules, we wouldn't have a lot of these problems. So yes, it should, and eventually I think it will, but for right now, it might still be susceptible to a spoof DOF.
Thank you.
So this is just the lay of the land of PMF. So the things that happen before the four-way handshake are not protected at all. After the handshake, everything has an integrity check, and then a subset of the action frames will be encrypted. And I promised you guys a little bit of a visual around the passphrase upgrade. Oh, and so just to reiterate this, PMF is a feature in all WPA3 flavors of networks. So passphrase or personal networks, enterprise networks using 802.1x, and also enhanced open. Enhanced open isn't technically part of WPA3, but enhanced open adds encryption and adds PMF. So it's, very close cousin of WPA3. So here's kind of my visual representation of understanding why SAE is so much better than PMF. This just sort of demonstrates how we have this other function happening here in that key derivation that makes the keys secure. It makes them appropriate length. It makes them uniquely for each device. And then here's the list of those things we talked about a little bit earlier, where when we move to a WPA3 secured network, we do get PMF. I didn't put that on here. So we get PMF, but we also get a network that's not susceptible to offline dictionary attacks, which I think is huge. So the key takeaway for this for WPA3 networks is that if somebody is attacking your network, you should be able to immediately identify it and take an action, either automated through security orchestration tools, or if you have that capability directly in the Wi-Fi infrastructure, that's great. But definitely you should be able to see an attack on this type of network and take an immediate action. And then I mentioned the perfect forward secrecy and all that other good juicy stuff. So looking at this from then kind of the security point of view, this is a grossly, of course, oversimplified view of this. I know when we did the boot camp, I gave you guys actual cleaned network diagrams from customer sites. And a lot of people are like, what is this thing? And what is that thing? And that is actually kind of more the real world view of what it looks like for a network. But conceptually, when we talk about points of inflection, points of configuration and testing for security and infrastructure, there's three main places, right? We've got the Wi-Fi infrastructure itself. So that's all of the APs, controllers, gateways, if you're using tunnel termination gateways. Then we have all of the network infrastructure behind it. Again, a gross oversimplification, but we've got switches, routers, firewalls, domain services, time, DNS, DHCP, and then authentication servers and services behind all of that. So lots of stuff over here. And then the endpoints, the users, and the space that they're traversing over the air. So these are the places that typically, we have access to as a wireless or a network professional, where we can inspect, design, or investigate and test. And so this is where I want to kind of talk through a little bit about what I look for and do. And I have some specific examples of how I've used Ekahau report files to make security recommendations to customers. So the first obvious one in the infrastructure is that we can find, so we know that we can find rogue APs, and we can also physically geolocate them, which is phenomenal, because the number one remediation effort for rogue APs should be to physically find them and remove them from the network. And I would probably add also educate the users better so that they're not doing that and they understand the impact it has, not just on security, but also in the airspace and the utilization of the rest of the legitimate networks. So that's a big one. Similar to that, but a little bit different, is going to be looking for interferers. And when we talk about security, you see letters here. A couple of the ways that we describe security, if anybody's ever taken really any of the security courses online, Security Plus, CISSP, SSCP, we talk about a security triad. Have you guys seen the security triad? Who knows the security triads?
I don't believe I've seen it.
Not
It
me.
looks like this.
Oh, okay. CIA. Got
Yep.
it.
Now, I always write this as IAC because when you're 20 something and you present CIA in a foreign country at a conference, actually it was Austria, people look at you funny. So these are the three letters though. It doesn't matter the order. If you want to use CIA, go for it. It's integrity. And we talked about integrity a second ago when we talked about protected management frames. It's availability. So is the resource accessible and usable? Availability is actually one of the foundations and cornerstones of security, which is fantastic because what it means is that we can justify a lot of the things we need to do in our designs and purchasing with this security. And then confidentiality. And we're going to pretend like you can read my handwriting. So that is the IAC or the CIA triad. And basically everything we do in security, and there's different models of this, but this is the most common one. It makes the most sense in an infrastructure context. So you'll see so rogue APs directly speak to preserving the integrity of the infrastructure. Now you could make arguments for other ones as well. Interferers are going to directly impact the availability of your corporate networks. The cryptography. So now we're getting into, the WPA versions, which we'll talk about in just a second, but also the cipher suites attached to them, because you guys know that leading up into WPA2, we still were supporting TKIP, but we were trying to get to AES. So the cryptography suite here speaks to the level of confidentiality and encryption capability. The WPA versions can sometimes, especially when you get to WPA3, it might relate to cryptography because WPA3 will demand at least 128-bit AES. So we're kind of hitting all parts of the triad there. Then the AP design and support for roaming. And this, I think, is very, very important. And I'll show you an example of this. So the long story short here is that one of the things we all want to do, I think, is use 802.1x networks anywhere we can. A lot of the devices, endpoints, and manufacturers have been instructing network designers to not use 802.1x for their devices. Biomedical and healthcare is a perfect example. There's a lot of examples in manufacturing and automation where those vendors will tell you, use a passphrase network. And that is because the roaming latency on an 802.1x network without a facilitation protocol and proper design is huge. So if you imagine that, an endpoint, an endpoint connects in, when it's doing 802.1x, you have your association, then you have the full 802.1x authentication, then you have the four-way handshake. When you roam, you have to repeat that whole thing again. And depending on the infrastructure, the radius server, there's lots of bumps in the wire logically with that. And so that makes a noticeable difference. When we can use a roaming facilitation protocol, basically we do that one time. When we roam from this AP to that AP, the next is basically nothing because it's an association, but it eliminates the reauthentication of 802.1x. and the four-way handshake is embedded in the other exchange. So it shortens it drastically down. But we can't use 802.1x for latency sensitive applications and use cases if we don't have that support. And we can't do the roaming in the FT if the APs aren't physically laid out and configured the way that it's going to support that. So, for all of you guys where you've worked in a place and you do a design and you take it to your management, and let's just say it has 40 APs on it for a space. And they come back and they go, great, that looks awesome. And then you see that they ordered 30 APs. I'm sure that's never happened to you guys. Maybe it's only me. But this happens all the time with all kinds of different customers. They're like, no, we don't need that many. Let's just get 30 for this space. And the problem then is we can't design to support the roaming protocols, which means we can't do 802.1x in some of these critical networks. And then
JJ,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, but we had a question coming from Guillermo earlier asking around FT and roaming. So the question was, why would you use FT in a pre-shared key network, or would you not recommend that?
That's a great question. I'll try to keep this short. So on WPA2 networks, it has been, it does give you a slight benefit. But if you remember where I said a lot of endpoints had like sticky wickets going along with FT AKMs, multiple AKMs, et cetera, the trade-off of a little bit of benefit for roaming and possibly endpoints that can't connect or use that FT network well, the smarter thing to do on a WPA2 network has been to not do FT on a passphrase. But going into WPA3, because of the SAE, you will get a more noticeable benefit. Well, I shouldn't say more noticeable. I don't know that you would notice it. If you were like watching, right, the microseconds go down, it is a benefit. I think we're still going to have the situation where we still have enough endpoints that are being weird with FT, especially in combination with WPA3 and transition modes, that you might not want to do that out of the gate. But I hope we get to the point where we can do that. And not to throw another monkey wrench in this, but one of the other things that happened along the timeline of the FT weirdness was that there was a point in time, and I hope I get this right because Stephen Orr will slap me if I get this wrong. I've asked him like 5 times to explain this. There was a point in time, I think, when they released 11R FT roaming that required a specific hashing algorithm. But PMF required a different one, and they didn't line up. And so nothing would work if FT and PMF were enabled on a network for a period of time. So there's just a bunch of kind of friction points with FT networks, especially for passphrase. That's a great question, though.
It's a great question. So why do you think the FT would improve roaming with personal SAE WPA3 and not WPA2? Is it because we have more packets that are required to be exchanged for the roaming to happen for the Diffie-Hellman?
Yeah, exactly. There's a slight difference, and this is one of those things that I haven't dug into too much because it's so much of the focus for what I do is on the 1X side, and we've not been advising people necessarily to enable FT on passphrase networks. But yes, because it does eliminate some of the back and forth, and there are additional exchanges related to when we talk about that integrity component, there's an additional set of keys that get derived and the keying material exchanged before the derivation. So the group keys basically is a new part of that algorithm to support PMF.
Gotcha. So we have another relevant question to this topic. We have a highly voted question, upvoted from Stula. And the question is, does WPA3 improve roaming?
I don't think so. Now, this is where you guys, Matt and Mac, and all of you guys listening, maybe somebody knows something I don't, and there's a different point of view here. So I think that we have a better opportunity to make use of FT, but I think that has to do with FT, not with WPA3.
So
does that make sense?
Basically, what matters is the personal versus enterprise and use of FT in enterprise, and really roaming between WPA2 or WPA3 will not change. It will be the same.
Yes. And I think the only asterisk I would put with that I know of is we have seen information from some of the vendors, including some that presented at WLPC, that gave us metrics on roaming between WPA2 networks and WPA3 networks, and WPA3 transition and WPA2 and 3 networks, if that makes sense. So not just normal roaming, but roaming between, if you had a transition mode here, which is doing WPA2 and 3, and you had a WPA2 network and you have a WPA3 network, there's some interesting behavior with personal versus enterprise, and with this roam versus that roam that is different and not necessarily good. But again, this has more to do with FT. And in this particular case, it has to do with the endpoint's ability to, if they're in a transition mode network and they're on as a WPA3 endpoint and they roam to a WPA3 only network, they're good. But if they're joined as a WPA2 endpoint and they roam to a WPA3 only network, that looks like it's going to be a hard roam, at least in the data that I've seen.
Are you talking about the presentation from Wes from WLPC?
Yes. Yeah.
So guys, if you haven't seen it, Wes was talking about the Wi-Fi 6, Wi-Fi 6E adoption 3 years in a row. And it was a great, fantastic presentation. Very technical, but very easy to digest at the same time. If you haven't seen it, it will be released shortly from WLPC in Phoenix by Wes Purvis. Very, very good presentation. Okay, JJ, I have another question relevant to the discussion. Does WPA3 slow down Wi-Fi speeds?
Oh, does WPA3 slow down Wi-Fi speeds? Are you asking because of the PMF overhead?
General question: is there anything in WPA3 that can slow down Wi-Fi? I think the concern is, okay, I have clients that enable WPA3. I'm ready to enable it. If I enable it, will I see it dropping my Wi-Fi throughput and data rates?
Oh, no, I can't. No. Now product managers and people who are looking again at these like nanoseconds and microseconds may have some specific data related to specific operations, because there is, with PMF, some things are encrypted, but those are management frames. And there is a different encryption load on the endpoint if we are bumping up from, so maybe I should say it depends. So if you were doing like TKIP on WPA2, and now you're going to a beefy AES, this has to speak to the processing capability of the endpoint. Not a problem on normal devices and compute things. If you started talking about like, super tiny form factor sensors and things that are deployed like that, now we're talking about switching to elliptic curve cryptography, which is actually drastically greater security with much less load and resource requirement. So if we get to that point where something is struggling with the algorithms we're using now, they're going to be switching those to use ECC instead. So there's nothing noticeable I have ever seen.
So would that mean that TKIP will be slower than more modern alternatives?
I'm not sure about the exact numbers related to that. I would not be using TKIP, whether it's faster or not, or slower, because it's a fully deprecated suite at this point.
And that leads to another question from the audience, from Kazi.
Okay.
Kazi asks, does TKIP, is it vulnerable?
Is TKIP vulnerable? Yes. Yes.
Okay. Give us like 2 sentences of an explanation why TKIP is vulnerable and why we shouldn't be using it, what we should use instead, and then let's crack on.
Oh, okay. I'd have to go dig into getting the nitty-gritties of that, because it's been a while since I've talked about it, because we've been on AES since WPA2. So we had that point, that crossover point with WPA2 networks where we were still supporting TKIP for legacy devices that had not had a hardware upgrade. But, again, WPA2 was in 2004. So TKIP was something we were using in 2004 to support things that were created before that and didn't have a hardware upgrade yet. So there's a lot of reasons that it's considered deprecated and not secure. And AES is what we're using with WPA3 moving forward. So even with the transition mode network for WPA3, it won't let you use TKIP.
Gotcha. Thank you very much, JJ.
Bryce says 2004 is medical equipment vendors call it brand new. Yes, then that's the challenge we have. All right, let me slip through the last little bit of this so I can get to some specific examples with survey files. So the backend network infrastructure stuff I'm kind of zipping through because I think probably you guys are more interested in the Wi-Fi and an endpoint side over the air. So here's some of the stuff that that I'm looking at and for during that design and survey process. And some of the stuff that I'm suggesting testing would be not necessarily natively built into the survey, from a pure Ekahau standpoint, but it's that you are going to be physically and logically well positioned to do these other tests while you're there. And so some of that has to do with testing segmentation, and there's segmentation over the air, and then there's segmentation back when we get into VLANs on the networking side as well. And the over the air, I think, gets overlooked. So just as a level set here, any network, any SSID that we're broadcasting, unless we go do some tweaks with some specific vendor settings, that network is going to be its own layer 2 broadcast domain. And so even over the air, we have options to segment at layer 2, and then we can also then segment at layer 3 and pass that on back into the infrastructure. The performance and reliability. So all of the things that you guys design for, and then you do with your survey validation, where you're making sure not just that there's coverage, but that the design is of a quality to support the type of applications that are going to be used. Again, that's speaking to availability, which is huge in security. And then this next couple here, the protection from on-path and man-in-the-middle attacks and protections from downgrade, really start to talk to some of the benefits we get with the new security suites. So that's kind of connected to the WPA version here. I'm not going to get on my ZeroConf MDNS soapbox, but I do have some feelings about using what are really consumer protocols in the enterprise space. They're not always appropriate, but I realize that they are required on certain types of networks and certain environments. And then the last one here is hidden SSIDs, which I think is a huge, to me, this is a huge vulnerability and a huge risk. I know at one point in time, there was a lot of guidance around hide the SSIDs. And there are times to do it. But the time to not do it is when you have endpoints and users who are going to connect to that network and then be physically moving with that device outside of your space. So as one example, if you're talking about a hospital and you have biomedical and clinical engineering networks, by all means, hide the SSIDs to not clutter things up for your guest, because those devices aren't going to go walk around Starbucks and airports. But if it's laptops or personal phones and devices that are going to be running around, what you don't want them doing is going out and broadcasting that they're looking for your corporate network while they're roaming around the rest of the world. So that's something else that I look for as well. So let me ask you guys. This is some slightly sanitized data from a real project. This particular project was several locations and probably 1.5 million or 2 million square feet total. So this list of broadcasting SSIDs actually just from one site had over 200 on it. What do you guys see here that draws your attention? That it's going to make you ask a question or have a concern about something?
So the wireless printer stands out to me. You have a few of those that are broadcasting SSIDs. Why is that enabled? Is a question that comes to my mind.
Yeah. Everybody's saying that. I say Chris says ADT. Okay. So yes, all of these printers that have direct Wi-Fi connection turned on, this to me is a little bit alarming. And this is safe to say because I have sanitized the crap out of these files. This is from a hospital system. And so this is something I would be concerned about, because probably these are in offices where, different admissions and nursing staff have access to patient data. And this is probably directly connected to, again, air quoting, their production networks. What else? Tim says hotspots. I saw some calling out. So yeah, some of you guys must work in healthcare because you're picking up on some of these very healthcare specific SSIDs that I left in here. Richard says there's a D-Link. Yeah. So a few things here. One of the things that I noticed is here's D-Link, here's AT&T, here's some hotspots. So these kind of indicate to me a few different things, which is this might be a rogue device, right? Somebody might have intentionally or not bought something and then plugged it in. And then some like this stand out to me because this is probably a not customized ISP or CPE wireless router that's sitting there, which tells me that there might also be other ingress or egress paths into this network that are not well controlled or documented. And that could mean a network both, just switch route Wi-Fi network, but also if that's an ISP equipment, there's a path externally out to the internet and back. And then, yeah, I see a lot of you guys catching, all kinds of, there's some duplication of, here's some multiple EMS networks with different numbers attached to them. There's people's hotspots happening here. So all kinds of things. So this is just the standard output from a survey here. Yeah, and that the ADT is broadcasting. So maybe that's okay. Maybe it's not. Some of these things are a little bit weird. There are some types of endpoints that don't like hidden networks, and there are definitely endpoints that won't connect to an open network. So all kinds of stuff here that's worth digging into, I think. The other one, I don't know if anybody called this out. There is a mirror casting device here, which we would want to look and see what that's connected to. See somebody saying Aaron is a nurse manager, so I'd go talk to him about the rogues. Yeah. So all kinds of fun stuff. So this is what I look for. Are the corporate SSIDs present and are they properly configured? Because while we would love to think that our environments are homogeneous and everything's beautiful and wonderful, the truth is a lot of these, especially complex environments like healthcare and even manufacturing, have different networks, and they may even have the same, what's intended to be the same network, but being serviced by different infrastructures. So maybe they're transitioning from vendor A to vendor B, but right now they have both up, or somebody has been kind of just duct taping and Frankensteining stuff together. So rogue APs, honeypots is another thing we can kind of catch here, understanding that, of course, the survey is a point in time, so it's not meant to be persistent monitoring. Hotspots, I think you guys called out all of these things here. Wi-Fi direct enabled devices like the printers, open networks that your devices might be connecting to and they shouldn't be, and then the ISP devices. So the other thing that I kind of look for here is, you guys, most people look at this and they go, okay, well, the coverage is bad. And that's true. But what happens if the coverage is bad? We talked about that triad, right? And availability is a huge one here. So making sure that the design is robust, it's going to support the use cases, the quality and performance is going to be there, and that supports our mission critical applications. So there's a few different domino things that happen in the world of security. We've got the availability play. There are also some follow-ons related to confidentiality and integrity, because if something's not working well, if this was the environment and this was a real environment, what happens here? They go buy their own crap and plug it in because your Wi-Fi is not good enough. So it also turns into not just availability. Yeah, Mike just said shadow IT. So it's like there's a lot that can be derived from this. And you guys know, as professionals working in this space, you can start to see where somebody's going to go, your Wi-Fi is not good enough. I'm going to figure my own stuff out. And they're going to run down to Best Buy. Now, the other fun thing is the second AP coverage. So why do we care about second AP coverage related to security? Roaming. Yeah, exactly. Yep. So all of the things we talked about related to and redundancy. So this plays into the resilience of the infrastructure as well as the roaming capability. And when we can roam, when we design for an FT network, we understand that we can do 802.1x anywhere, at least that the endpoints support it. You want, when we talk about 802.1x, you really want the endpoint to be the only thing that stops you from doing an 802.1x endpoint. You don't want it to be the design. You don't want it to be the infrastructure capabilities. It's easy to spin up a radius server. So I'm totally okay if I walk in and somebody says, look, we just can't update these endpoints to do 1x. We're not on a refresh cycle. I'm cool and I will work around that. But any other reason to not do 802.1x is totally within our control. All right, are you guys ready for my top 5? Should we take questions? What do you want to do?
Top 5.
Top 5. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to go through them kind of quickly, at least the first 2, because these are the things that I would do co-located with a survey while I was there. I would do that segmentation validation. There's 2 ways to do that. You can do stuff over the air. So you can put 2 devices on the same SSID and test access between them. If you have NetAlly tools, they have all kinds of cool things, including reflectors and stuff you can test with. The hardening, you can test and validate the management access. And so, I'm not getting into trying to break into things at this point, but you can at least do your like basic due diligence of, if I'm an endpoint and I come onto the network, and if you're doing a survey, you can probably go ahead and do an active and get attached to the infrastructure and move around. Can you at least validate in these things that you can't get to the management interface? And then if you do get to the management interface, is it at least configured in a way that's meaningful? It's using an encrypted protocol, and doesn't have services open that shouldn't. So any services anywhere on the network that we're not using should be disabled everywhere within the infrastructure, within the endpoints. And then we've talked about rogue APs several times. This is just, to me, low-hanging fruit. And I know that this is like the bane of everybody's existence because it's so hard to control the users. And at least in the US, it's not considered to be responsible for us to do over-the-air mitigation. It's technically in violation of FCC rules. So, I've mentioned before, you want to physically go locate and remove those and educate the users as much as you can. I know that that's a tall order. If it's something that can be built into your security awareness training, then maybe go to the team that handles that and see if they can work that in for you. And then we get into that roaming support. I think this is huge, and we have a lot of opportunity here because there are so many places I walk in, and the endpoints could be on a 1X network. I mean, shoot, HP printers, any enterprise printers for the past over 10 years, maybe 15, have supported 802.1x. Voice over IP phones, you usually just need a firmware update to support 802.1x. Like the list is pretty long. And so when we're talking about things that matter, endpoints, networks, I would definitely switch to 802.1x anywhere you can, but you have to design properly. And I do reiterate this in the security community, trying to get people and the leaders to stop downscoping your designs. And so there's actually something else I'll make available to everybody too, maybe as a follow-up. I do have a list of it's like a top 10 notes for leadership that's non-technical about why in Wi-Fi, it's in the book, why in Wi-Fi we need certain things. We need to do certain things and need not to do certain things. And downscoping APs is one of the things we need to not be doing. And it is directly a security play right here. So we can just put that in their terms of, here's why we need the 40 APs, not 30. And hopefully that will help your case. And then the last thing here is to start looking for WPA3 networks. Now, I know this is a little bit of an aspirational comment because I understand that we are all mostly 99.9999 9% on WPA2 networks, and I'm okay with that. It's definitely challenging to make a leap to WPA3 on those passphrase networks. But if we can start doing it, start looking for that on your 802.1x network, and then take this in the context, if you can't do a WPA3 passphrase, be looking for 2 SSIDs. So you'll have a WPA2 thing for IoT stuff, a WPA3 network, and just let them be 2 separate networks. Because even if you get something that connects to transition mode, it will probably require manual intervention anyway. So if the idea is, I want to do transition mode so I don't have to touch the endpoints, you're probably going to have to touch them anyway. So just go ahead and touch them one time, put them on the WPA3 network, leave the stuff that can't over there on the WPA2, and then segment the ever-loving crap between them.
So JJ, with that said, a question is, what is your suggestion over voice over Wi-Fi then, where there may be devices that don't play nice with WPA3 but need fast transition? Should they just stick with WPA2 for now in those cases?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of those where, I don't ever want, what is it they say? Don't let perfection be the enemy of progress or something like that. So any 802.1x and FT is good. And really, the only big boost you get for a 1x network with WPA3 is the protected management frames. And I think there's value in that, but not at the expense of dropping off endpoints that don't support it for a critical application.
Thank you.
Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Thank you, Bryce. Yes. Okay, I see a couple questions here that I anticipated when I said split SSIDs. So Thomas is asking about the benefit of multiple SSIDs. I mentioned make 2, WPA2 and 3 for a passphrase network. Is it worth the cost of the added airtime utilization? So I got in this big discussion. So one of the things, there's a lot of stuff Stephen Orr and I are not necessarily in alignment on. He's smarter than I am, so he's right, but I don't necessarily agree with him. But one of the things that we both did agree on is that we're at a period in time where it makes sense to add more SSIDs. Because for years and years and years, we've been telling people to collapse SSIDs. And I have worked tirelessly with customers to do all kinds of cool NAC projects and dynamic VLAN assignments and jumping through hoops to let everything come into one network or 2 networks, and then we dynamically put them where they should be. But remember that those are still broadcast domains over the air. And part of the reason was the airtime utilization. So I got into a conversation with this with, Peter, and then I went back to Andrew Von Naj, who made that original airtime overhead calculator that is still, it's old, but it's still valid. And what we kind of all came to is it does matter for that beaconing. I might use the wrong words here. You guys can help me out. It does matter, right, for the beaconing because you have to work with the lowest common denominator. But the new Wi-Fi protocols are so much faster that overhead and loss is negligible from an impact standpoint. It's not going to impact the devices actually then getting on and the speed with those modulation rates that they're going to use to go faster than they were going before. So there is still added airtime utilization, but I think what we've all come to now, we all have different numbers. I think Peter was conservative and I'm probably stretching his number, but I think he arrived maybe around 6. So if I think 6, it might've been less than 6. I don't think Andrew gave me a specific number, but said, yes, it's accurate, but it's less impactful to the overall airspace and airtime. And Alexander's asking, should we jump directly on WPA3 Enterprise 192-bit mode if available? I haven't tested that enough yet. I believe it does require, and I should know this, and I don't. I believe it does require some upfit on the radius side, which is probably just a upgrade update. I haven't tested enough. I would definitely just test that in the lab, and if the endpoints support it, go for it. 192-bit mode is considered the CSNA suite or the cipher suite that is appropriate for use by the US federal government. But the hope of the working group for security is that any security conscious organization will move towards that. So it's not just for federal networks.
Okay, we have like so many great questions. We are still sitting on 15 unanswered. So let's answer a few more, maybe like
Okay.
a 2 or 3. There is one that I find very interesting to talk about from Ned. Personal pre-shared private keys seem to be joining the scene for devices like IoT not capable of .1x. And the question here will be, will WPA3 work with PPSK? So PPSK, MPSK, IPSK, same stuff, different name for the same thing. What are your thoughts on PPSK and WPA3?
Okay. That's a great question, Ned. WPA3 breaks the PPSK MPSK model. What I'm still trying to find out from Stephen and friends is why, because there is still a code, an identifier that's specific to the device and the key. So there is the information we would need to do MPSK, PPSK with WPA3. It's just not being utilized that way currently. And I don't understand enough to know what needs to change. My understanding is the infrastructure plays a part in that as well as the endpoints. So something would have to change. I do believe that there is, I'm not going to mention vendor names because I'm not sure who it was or if this is totally accurate, but my understanding is there is a vendor who is doing that. And I believe the way they are doing it is with a downgrade attack. So in theory, downgrade attack shouldn't be really possible, but if it's coming from the infrastructure that you've associated with and you've exchanged keys with, it can probably manipulate the endpoint in ways an external device or user couldn't. So I'm not a huge fan of, if that's what's happening, I'm not a huge fan of that. I think maybe we will get to the point where we can do that or something similar. I do think there's use cases. I mean, the different keys have different values, right? You can get different cryptography keys with WPA2, but it also lets you make these little micro networks and do kind of little mini segmentation, auto magical things as well. And then some people are using MPSK, PPSK for device identity. Oh, okay, we know if somebody used this key, it was facilities management, it was instructional education, it was this group or that group. So I think there's still value in them, and I think we just have to figure out a way to make that work with WPA3, and that is above my pay grade.
Hey, before we answer any more of the questions in the Q&A, maybe we could show everyone still on the webinar how Ekahau can help you mitigate some of these security vulnerabilities. So I might just steal the share from you, JJ, for a couple of minutes. Whilst we quickly run through this, because conscious that there's sometimes so many innovations and updates from Ekahau, it's hard to keep up with some of the new features and updates we have. And recently, our survey application got a really great update, especially related to this topic of security. We actually have these really new visualizations specific to security that helps you find any of those issues, especially like the ones that JJ was mentioning earlier. If you've got any rogue access points, if you've got any interfering devices in your network, even if they're non-Wi-Fi, like cameras, Bluetooth, infrared, that kind of device. And also, if you've got any devices that in your network that you've configured, maybe some of your access points that's not using the strongest method of encryption, we can easily identify them for you now. So what is the first one, Mac?
The first one is to locate the rogue APs. And as we've discussed today in the session, multiple times today, actually, all the access points that are not part of your network, they are considered rogue or interfering APs. Anything that adds more beacons into the air, you want to remove them from the network to improve your airtime utilization and bring down the overhead, beacons overhead. So all your other devices, they are faster. And locating rogue APs is extremely simple. Now you just walk around and you have them on the map. You know exactly where they are, go there, remove them, and your life is better.
Yeah, and because our Sidekick and Sidekick 2 has a spectrum analyzer inbuilt to the device, when you survey your environment, not only does it collect all of the Wi-Fi data and information, but it can also locate anything that's non-Wi-Fi. So in this example here in the Helsinki office, they had, maybe it was lunchtime because they had a microwave on. So as they was walking through the office, it detected there was a microwave impacting on 2.4 gigahertz. But if you had a device in here that was working on 5 gigahertz or causing you issues on some of your other channels, just like we locate your access points and your rogue access points, we can locate these interferers and place them on the map for you. So this is a really cool new update that if you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend you check it out.
And guys, look at the chat. JJ is offering a free ebook, which is an awesome ebook. Okay, so guys, get that ebook. It's fantastic on .1x. And also don't forget to look into JJ's book, like a big book, the 600 pages. This is probably the best security book I've ever seen in my life. And Matthew is showing it to his camera now. She's not like, asking us to say that. This is like an honest opinion from us. It's that good. It's amazing. Okay, another benefit of just walking around with your Sidekick and Ekahau Suite is to identify APs, broadcasting stuff with weaker than ideal security. So if you are using web or a WPA original, and you have some TKIPs enabled, as discussed before today, we will highlight that with an exclamation mark now.
And in case you missed it, we launched a brand new survey-only SaaS-based model license called Measure and Measure Plus. And included in the survey-only license is still the security visualization. So if you need to delegate data collection to members of your team that just go on site and collect survey data, even when they do their walk around, once they've finished their survey on site, they can analyze that data and they can see those security visualizations. So if they need to go and track down one of those rogue devices or interferers, they can quickly and easily do that. So it's a new survey only license that we recently launched, and also our security visualizations as well. I think these paired together can really help you keep your Wi-Fi networks as secure as possible, and implementing the tips from JJ in the webinar, that theory, and using the software and the hardware tools that we provide you with Ekahau, you can really keep your Wi-Fi networks much more secure. And talking about great content, we have a fabulous webinar coming up next, don't we, Mac?
Yes, we do. So guys, if you like this kind of practical tips, answering your questions live and having access to the brightest brains in the Wi-Fi industry, join us in 2 weeks' time. We will have Rowell, a host from Clear to Send podcast, and he's a great consultant, great friend, and amazingly experienced Wi-Fi professional. We'll be talking about managing large and challenging Wi-Fi environments, and it will be extremely, extremely interesting.
Yeah, so that was the slides we just wanted to quickly run through. Thank you so much for staying on for a bit longer, everybody, and JJ. So why don't we try and answer a few of these most upvoted questions in the chat. Mac, I think you marked a couple, or Dale, you had some that you wanted to
yeah, we have plenty.
answered.
So let me start with a very, very quick one. I will be a little bit quicker than the questions. JJ, what do you think about Mac authentication?
Is somebody messing with me? Who are you? Oh, somebody's opening a can of worms. I'm okay with Mac-based authentication when it's
me
not
authenticating.
when it's yes. Let me see your passport, sir. Papers. Oh man. Yeah, it's okay, because it's really the only option we have in some cases. So I'm okay with it, but I want it to not be as a sub process off of an 802.1x network or port. So I don't like MAB. I don't like Mac authentication bypass as a sub function of 802.1x. And I would want to see some mitigating control. So I would want to see something that could profile that endpoint and make sure that a printer didn't suddenly turn into a Linux device, and do a validation of that on reconnect or constantly. And I would want to see it segmented very much. And if, depending on what that thing has access to and what that thing is, that might mean putting it through a firewall or something that can capture a more granular policy and log versus just traditional VLANs, ACLs, VRFs.
Exactly. We need to remember that it's possible to eavesdrop on the MAC address that is authorized to access the network, and you can assign this MAC address to a different device potentially. Okay, so that's all the questions from me for today. Dale, Matt, do you have any more questions that you would like to answer? Appreciate it.
Yeah, one final one. This one says PMD, perhaps means perhaps PMF, but protects against AP spoofing. But how about man in the middle APs? How can we protect against or protect the clients from associating to them, especially personal networks?
Okay. Sorry, I was scrolling up to find that one. Okay, there's a few different ways to do that. I'm not really a fan of over-the-air mitigation. I don't think that's the right answer for a lot of different reasons. What you can do, if it's a endpoint that you manage, which I assume you would if this is the use case, then you can push, again, it depends on the environment. This is not appropriate for everybody. In a secured environment, we would take a managed endpoint and we would push a profile to it through MDM, Intune, group policy, whatever, and we would tell it to only connect to certain devices. And we can even attach that. So especially like secured 1X networks, we can lock that down granularly to a specific certificate or root CA. Now, that's one answer. I don't love that answer because for most users and most environments, people are mobile, they're working remotely, they're in Starbucks, they're in Hilton's, they're in airports, wherever. And what we need to do is not rely on trusted networks, but work towards that zero trust architecture model where everything is every protect surface is its own, every asset is its own little protect surface. And we need to do a better job protecting the endpoint through tools and monitoring and not care what network it's attached to.
All right, thank you.
That's down the road.
Yeah, that's about all that I have right now. Definitely a lot of questions that came up for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if you've been able to keep up with the chat, JJ, but the feedback has been awesome. People have really enjoyed your content and your presenting. I think a lot of people have picked up the book now, from what I've seen too, from the chat.
Thanks, guys.
Oh, thank you, JJ, for donating your time. It's amazing for you to find the time to share your knowledge with the community. I think everyone will be, come on, work, lasers.
Lasers.
Okay.
I don't have that. I'm on a Windows machine. Yeah, well, I appreciate this community because I'm always learning from the community when I have questions. I mean, it's all of you guys that I come to looking for answers. None of us do this by ourselves, I don't think. I certainly don't.
No,
Great
for
stuff.
sure. So, I just want to say a huge thank you, obviously, JJ, for taking the time. Especially we've gone on nearly 25 minutes over than the scheduled time. We still have like a bazillion people on the webinar. So that goes just a testament for how great the content has been today. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us and present that. And thank you so much to everybody for joining us on this webinar and staying on for so long. We look forward to having you on the next one. But a big thank you from us and the Ekahau team, JJ, and everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Anders, for that.
Yeah. See you, everybody.
See ya.